So how many of you, like me, is a firstborn child? Okay. I'm just looking around to see who all the responsible ones are. Right? I mean, we all have younger siblings. They go out and they have all the fun, but we take care of so many things. We just have that burden on us. Hello, I'm in Martha's Anonymous Club. Martha gets kind of a bum rap here, but by the end of my sermon, I'm going to bring Martha around to being a full-blown believer in Jesus. But in the meantime, we have to put up with this younger sibling who seems to get the best press out of this. So Jesus says that Mary has the good portion. So what does Mary have that Martha doesn't? Well, first of all, I don't think that this is Mary's first time with Jesus. I think she's been around with Jesus before, and she knows who he is. And I think this might be one of Martha's first experiences of being with Jesus. So what does Mary have that Martha doesn't? So perhaps Mary realized that in Jesus, she was seeing the invisible God, and that the fullness of God was pleased to dwell in him. Now, those are Paul's words in his letter to the Colossians, explaining who Jesus is. In the Gospels, we get the story of Jesus. We get stories of his birth, stories of his ministry, miracles, his crucifixion, his resurrection. But the Gospels don't explain everything about Jesus. But Paul is explaining to all these churches exactly who Jesus is and why it matters. But I have this sense that the reason why Mary just sat at the feet of Jesus and did not help Martha prepare the meal was that she knew that Jesus was different. That Jesus was God who had finally returned. She was a good Jew. She was hoping for the Messiah to come, for God to return to the temple. And in Jesus, she met a man who was just so different that he must be God. So in Jesus, Mary found someone where she would just sit at his feet and listen to every single word that came out of his mouth. Now, perhaps Mary knew true forgiveness in Jesus. Perhaps she was someone who had been hostile in mind and doing evil deeds. Perhaps she had been away from home. Perhaps she had been up in Galilee. Perhaps she wasn't living her best life now, but was living a more sinful life up there. And maybe Mary met Jesus there. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. And perhaps she received forgiveness from Jesus. And all of a sudden she realized that there was this unconditional love from God that completely changed everything. When you are loved unconditionally, that is so different than conditional love. I was blessed with parents who loved me unconditionally. I was speaking once to my grandfather, my father's father, and he was asking me why I had done so well in life. And I said, because of my parents. I said, they will love me no matter what I do. He said, baloney. Actually, that was not the word he used, but I'm in church. My grandfather was a conditional lover, but I had parents who loved me unconditionally. What a great foundation to give someone. And I think Mary had experienced that unconditional love in Jesus. She had been forgiven. I think she'd also experienced reconciliation. Perhaps she had been apart from God. All of us at some point in our lives can either walk away from or turn our back on God. Oh God, you must not exist because this wouldn't be happening right now. But she had been reconciled, brought back to God. And maybe she'd been reconciled with her family as well, with Martha and Lazarus, who might have been disappointed in her, but somehow she had experienced reconciliation. And she knew that Jesus was that source. And she was going to sit there and listen to everything he said because she was just learning so much from him. The meal can wait. This is much better than the meal. Perhaps Mary understood in her gut that Jesus held all things together. On the morning of July 4th, later that morning when I began to hear of all the horrible flooding in the hill country, especially around Hunt, it seemed like Jesus was not holding everything together. All the news that I was getting was horrible, and you were getting exactly the same news. And then I was hearing these stories about people who had died, people who were missing, people who had barely made it out alive. It didn't seem like Jesus was holding everything together. But of course, I know that he holds everything together because I have a deep faith. But there are times, there are moments when it just seems like the world is falling apart. But I think Mary sensed that in Jesus, everything was beginning to make sense of why God created the world, why God came into the world. Everything was being held together by Jesus. And perhaps in Jesus, Mary began to understand that her sufferings in her life were taking on new meaning. Suffering is a part of life. We've all suffered at some point in our lives. And that's sometimes when we feel like God isn't there or God doesn't care. But I know God cares. And Mary knew that God cared for her. And whatever her sufferings were taking on new meaning. With that flood on July 4th, there was much suffering. Some of you know, some of you probably don't know, but we held a funeral here in this space on Friday for a family of 4 who died in that flood. The father, the mother, the 2 young sons. 4 caskets in this space. I've never experienced that before. All the people gathered were suffering because of loss. Loss of people they knew and loved. Yet in the midst of that suffering, Jesus showed up in a most powerful way. And our faith was reaffirmed in the resurrection from the dead, and that in spite of the suffering in this world, Jesus is holding everything together. In the spite of loss and grief, there was also joy and love and the powerful presence of the Spirit. That's why we do burial services. We remember the great promises of the resurrection from the dead. And people shared from this pulpit tributes about the husband and the wife, about the father and the mother, and their great faith in knowing Jesus and in treating other people with that kind of Christian love that we all should treat other people with. And all of a sudden, the sufferings take on new meaning because there's a God who cares about us, who loves us unconditionally. When we put Jesus first in our life, like Mary was, our life needs, desires, wants, priorities, they get reordered. And that is why Jesus said to Martha, Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Jesus will never be taken away from us. Nothing can separate us from his love. And that is good news. But I don't want to leave Martha there. So just before Jesus raised her brother Lazarus from the dead, Jesus and Martha were talking. And Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this, Martha? And Martha said to him, Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Martha had the good portion too. And I pray that each of us knows that portion. Amen.